Welcome to another terrifying tale from Nightmare Alley. We want to provide content like this for a long time to come, and your support will help make that happen. Now sit back and brace yourself for another spine-tingling tale.
The Regrettable Return of John Wiermore, Chapter 1, The Kitchen. John Wiermore emerged from the mist like a befuddled phantom, the kind that wore a handlebar mustache and a threadbare flannel jacket. Hannah hadn't noticed John standing confused and lost-looking at the end of their long driveway, one foot kicked out almost comically from an ankle injury received during his brief stint in the U.S. Army. It wasn't just the swirling night fog or the way his silhouette was backlit and made bleary by the glittering ice crystals and swarming lights behind him. Mostly it was because she was keeping an eye on the roiling pasta water on the stove and dicing the living crap out of an onion like it was therapy. A high-pitched noise was drilling into Hannah's skull that she had at first thought was her tinnitus acting up. As she wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand and tossed the culprit onions into a hot frying pan, she slowly began to assume that a neighbor's alarm was going off, or a power line was acting up. "Hon, do you hear that sound? It's driving me crazy," Hannah called out from the kitchen before remembering her husband was picking up Olivia from volleyball practice while she made dinner. Hannah swore under her breath and turned to grab a zucchini to dice up for the red sauce when the pitch of the maddening noise spiked, high enough to physically hurt the middle-aged woman's ears. She practically threw the carving knife she used to chop most anything while she cooked into the sink and protectively cupped her ears. She stood there, staring down into the porcelain sink, waiting for the pain to subside, wondering if she was perhaps having a stroke, just as a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard clawed through her mind and down her spine, pulling her nerve endings out by the root in the process. She could hear as much as feel the pounding of her heart web-webbing in her chest and ears. The pounding was so loud and painful, she was certain she really was having a stroke. Hannah stood there in front of the sink for what to her seemed like a lifetime, gripping the lip of the counter in front of her as if her sanity depended on it. Jaw clenched so tightly she was bound to shatter a crown or two. Slowly the sounds and sensations faded, leaving her ill and clammy in a way Hannah associated with motion sickness. She took a deep breath and tossed cold tap water on her face. A flash of light outside the kitchen window caught Hannah's eye. "Thank God my babies are home," Hannah said in a low voice. She was shivering as if a body fluid just struck her. Whatever she just went through, whatever the cause, had been a meat grinder. Except her babies weren't pulling up in the driveway. It took Hannah a few blinks to realize that a man was standing at the end of her driveway, and that man, wearing his signature blue flannel, baseball cap, and one foot kicked out at an odd angle, was also her husband. A different husband. A husband who had gotten fat over time. A husband who had been missing and presumed dead for just over 10 years. Jesus, maybe I am having a stroke. Chapter 2, The Shed House. John sat in a chair too small for his 6'4", 275 pounds body. The dimly lit shed house, sitting in the backyard of what would have been his home, felt like a dollhouse to a man of his build. Although it had been his home when he left for work that morning, it clearly no longer was. He felt like he had walked out of the fog into a world that was no longer his own. He had taken his normal walk back from his furniture factory along the river, expecting to find Hannah and Olivia waiting at the dinner table for Wednesday night spaghetti night. It was a family tradition. Instead, he had stepped out of the hoary fog coming off of Riverwalk Lane only to stop dead in his tracks. The house sitting in front of him on property that had been in his family for 3 generations wasn't his home. After the strange walk he had just endured, he at first assumed he had gotten turned around and was in front of someone else's home, but he recognized the property and the house number was definitely his. Even after the strange humming and screeching ceased ripping his brain apart, and the photophobia-like light show swarming about him had faded, all he could do was stare dumbly at the house that should have been his home. Naturally, he thought he was losing his mind, even as Hannah raced out the front door to him, hysterically calling his name over and over. All he could do was look in confusion at the strange world around him. Strange, but familiar. It wasn't the things that were completely different that made him sick to his stomach and feel like his brain had been blended inside his own skull. It was the things that were the same but somehow not the same that threatened to put him over the edge. Even his wife seemed different, more energetic and healthier, full of a vitality he had not seen in her for more than 10 years. Even the pretty brunette hair he had fallen in love with in junior high seemed healthier and prettier than it had in years. He couldn't make out Hannah's frantic words. She was scared and every bit as bewildered as he was. Slowly he realized she was leading him into their backyard to the prefab Costco shed house that he in no way ever purchased in his entire life and certainly never had delivered to his property. It was warm and homey, dimly lit. Hannah had flipped on a bright overhead light while sheepdogging him into the 12x24 accommodation. But the light hurt John's eyes so badly he started flailing out like an overstimulated autistic kid. Hannah switched to a dim table lamp and ushered John to the chair he now sat in. She had always been good at sheepdogging him around and calming him when he was having social anxiety issues. It was cozy and had Hannah's taste for home decor written all over it. The kitchen and bathroom were tiny, but that didn't stop Hannah from shoving an oversized fridge into the place. The smaller kitchen freed up square footage for a sizable living room with a couch and several comfortable chairs. From the uncomfortable chair John sat in at a small table beside the window, he could see that this shed was for entertaining guests and drinking late into the night. If someone got too drunk, they could climb up to the tiny loft in the back of the shed above the bathroom and slip into a twin bed. John was certain that the couch was a pull-out and there was at least one air mattress tucked away in a cabinet somewhere. That was just how Hannah Wiermore operated. John cracked the window as he lit a fresh cigarette with the butt of the one he had just finished. The butts were piling up in a mason jar lid he had found in a kitchen drawer. The shed was filling with the smoke. Hannah never smoked and hated the habit John brought back from the army with him. From the window he could see his darkened backyard and the house that should have been the family home he had inherited from his dad. The yard looked pretty much as it should, with the exception of the shed house he was chain-smoking in and the fire pit flanked by the Adirondack deck chairs just off the tiny porch. From there he could see the big window in the back of the house where the family room was. He could make out figures moving behind the drawn blinds and occasionally peering out at him, but couldn't tell who they were. John never really felt entirely comfortable or that he belonged anywhere he was, not even in his own home, but never had he felt like an intruder before. Never had he felt like people were scared of him, let alone his own family. He'd be angry and charge right in his own back door and demand to know why he was being treated like a leper if it wasn't for how queasy and jittery he felt after the god-awful walk he had taken along the river. John smashed out his cigarette into the mason jar lid. Hannah never allowed ashtrays in the house, but she collected mason jars and an entire host of mismatched lids like a fiend. He needed a drink and knew a variety of cold beers awaited in the fridge. He found a bottle of some bullcrap microbrew before spotting a fifth of Patron sitting on the counter. "Screw it," John said with a shrug of broad but slouching shoulders as he grabbed up the bottle. He didn't bother looking for a shot glass as he made the way back to the chair with both bottles. Chapter 3. The Guest. John was taken aback when Mathew Cox let himself into the shed house without knocking. John hadn't seen Mathew in years. He had no idea why the well-groomed man would just let himself in, let alone why he had a fifth of Jack in one hand. Mathew's face grew visibly repulsed as he stepped into the shed, only to be blasted by the smoke and whatever BO John was currently stewing in after a long day of working with his hands at the shop. "Jesus, John," Mathew said, practically gagging. "Open a damn window." "It is," John replied, distantly, as he adjusted his baseball cap on his head. Mathew considered the situation, then elected to leave the front door open to air the place out. He sat down across from his hulking old friend, slamming the bottle of Jack down on the table with showmanship. "Let's drink," the smaller man pronounced, a specter of a salesman grin hunting about, judging to see if it was safe to come out and play with the brooding man across from him. John took a deep drag of his cigarette and let the smoke do whatever the hell it wanted as he spoke. "Beat you to it," he said, in a low, weary voice. Mathew cocked both eyebrows and nodded his head as he glanced at the table between them. Flanking the pile of butts building up in the mason jar lid were a few empty bottles of the microbrew and a severely diminished bottle of Patron. "Wow, yeah you have," Mathew concluded. "I hope you don't mind if I join you." John didn't care enough to scoff. He was well on his way to drinking his problems gone. He had grown tired of Mathew's smug attitude years ago, long before they finally parted ways as business partners. Mathew saw he was getting nowhere with his old friend, so crossed the shed to the kitchen to find a couple of clean tumblers. He filled them both from the ice cube dispenser on the front of the fridge before trying another attempt. "Do you like the beer?" Mathew asked. "It's from a company I'm part owner of." "It's fine for a fag beer," John replied, not bothering to do anything besides stare absently out the window of what should have been his backyard as his cigarette smoldered in his stained, chubby fingers. Mathew sighed. That was the John Wiermore he remembered. He knew his old friend enough to appreciate when it was pointless to try small talk on him. He crossed back to the table and poured Jack for them both. As he sat, he demonstrably slid the tumbler to John. "Okay, John, let's skip the chit-chatting part and get right to it." Mathew leveled knowing eyes at a man who was once a dear friend, a business partner. John couldn't be bothered to acknowledge that he even heard the man. Ice clinked as Mathew drank his drink down in one gulp. He poured himself another before stating as calm and matter-of-factly as one could, "John, how the hell are you alive and sitting in my backyard?" Chapter 4. The Conversation. John flinched at the question, but otherwise continued to slowly pull from his cigarette and stare in the general direction of the family room of the house that was no longer his home. He blew a thick plume of smoke out the window before speaking. "You've always been a hyperactive, overly entitled little dickhead, but please, go on and explain to me how my backyard belongs to you." "Because, John, you've been dead for 10 years. Well, technically, you've been missing and are presumed dead. No one ever found your body." John turned to level his big watery eyes on his obnoxiously handsome old friend. At one time, John was handsome himself, in a different way than Mathew, but he was good enough to get Hannah Millhouse when she was still in her prime. Now, in the dark room, chubby cheeks more like jowls, double chin, pouty lips, crow's feet, stained teeth, reeking from a day of working in a factory. Well, John looked like the kind of trash human that lived in a van down by the river. Those big dumb cow eyes couldn't intimidate a school kid now. But Mathew knew John wasn't a total idiot. Mathew knew John had the strength of a man John's size and the temper to use it if push came to shove. Mathew was intimidated by John, physically at least. John rolled his shoulders around as if in great discomfort and slid a hand into his lap. Mathew didn't like that at all. He wanted to see both John's hands at all times. John rubbed at his neck with one hand, cigarette pinched between fingers. To Mathew, it looked like the man was about to crawl out of his own fat skin suit. "I'm sitting right here, Matt," the big man finally said, unable to properly focus his eyes on his old friend. "What the hell do you mean I've been missing? I haven't so much as missed a single day of work in 15 years. Mathew's right hand slipped into his own lap as he brought his drink to his lips with the other. At the sound of the clinking ice cubes, he nearly jumped up and pulled the .357 Magnum out from where he was hiding it in the folds of his baggy sweater. John might not know why he should be dead, but Mathew sure as hell did. "How is it possible when I killed you myself 10 years ago?" Mathew watched John's body language closely. His old business partner recoiled a little at his words. Not in shock, like the truth hurt. John rubbed at the back of his neck and cupped the back of his skull as if something inside of him was burrowing its way out. John had what looked like a neck spasm to Mathew, and he watched as the entire side of John's neck seemed to bulge and undulate. It was probably just a trick of the light, but whoever this John was, he wasn't a healthy man. John slowly opened his mouth, presumably to speak, but to Mathew it looked like his jaw was about to unhinge so the bigger man could swallow him up whole. John worked his jaw, confused as to why his words wouldn't come. "I'm sitting right here," the hulking man said, finding his words. "And you were telling me this is your home? Okay, then why is Hannah still living here? Why can I see here and my baby girl peeking out at me from the family room window like I'm some kind of rogue bear they just called the game commission on?" "Have a drink, John," Mathew instructed, indicating John's tumbler of Jack and melting ice. John glanced at it and tossed a cigarette into it before reaching for the Patron bottle. Mathew gripped the handle of the Magnum in his lap, wishing that he could see what John's hand was doing in his own lap. That fat bastard could be so damn stubborn. "Fine, I'm tired of trying this nice. Here's the thing, John. You're dead. I know you're dead because I killed you myself 10 years ago in that crappy shop we used to own together. One late night, I shoved you into a lathe when you were turning bedposts or some crap, grinded you up like yesterday's chipped ham. Your blood and guts splatter all over me." Mathew brought his tumbler to his mouth, his hands shaking so badly the ice tinkled the entire way to his mouth. But at least he finally got John's fat-ass attention. "Sounds kinda sloppy," John replied, incredulous. "It was, but I planned for it. I had scrubs I stole from my brother a few months earlier. He was just finishing med school back then, and I had been planning to kill you for a long, long time. Long before you jacked up the Aston Furnishings deal. Missing those deadlines and having that $500,000 purchase order canceled on us was reason enough to shove you into that old lathe. But by then it was just one more goddamn reason." "How did you dispose of my body?" John asked, actually smirking, until a rippling spasm raced up and down the arm he kept partially concealed in his lap, so violent Mathew could actually see it. The pain of it robbed a smirk from John's fat, pale face. Mathew wasn't sure how John could look more disgusting and stupid than he normally did, but he pulled it off, with all the grimacing and spasming he was doing. "Simple. Remember that powder we kept by the gallon to clean saw blades? You mix it with water and it became acid?" John nodded as he lit his last cigarette clumsily with one hand. "Yeah, well, I sawed your fat ass up with a skill saw and shoved you into drums filled with acid. I sealed those up along with the scrubs, and then I torched that old crap-hole furniture shop we were wasting our lives in." "Did you ever think of just asking to buy me out?" John asked. Something approximating levity filled his voice, and he began to chuckle. He wasn't sure, under the circumstances, how he could find his sense of humor. But considering he had just walked home after a 12-hour day at the furniture shop with nothing on his mind other than to enjoy Wednesday night spaghetti night with his family, just to come home to this? He should have been cackling like a lunatic. John's chuckle was quickly replaced by a wet cough. Mathew watched more in horror than disgust as John seemed to be gagging, mouth working stupidly as phlegm or some other viscous fluid worked its way out of his mouth and down his knobby chin. The sight nearly made Mathew throw up, but he decided to keep forging forward. He had every intention of goading his old friend into a fight so he could gun him down fair and square on his own property. "Buying you out wasn't good enough. I wanted to completely rebuild. I needed you totally out of the way, and I needed the insurance money to rebuild a proper company on property that your idiot family didn't own." "How would that even work?" John asked. He eyeballed the Patron bottle as he wiped at the viscous goo on his chin. But whatever was tearing up John's insides made him reconsider consuming more tequila. It was probably a trick of the light, but Mathew thought he saw the thin skin of John's wrist bulge and writhe, like a swarm of baby snakes were making their way up and down his dumb fat arms. But they were gone as quickly as he saw them. It had to have been his imagination. "Hannah would have inherited everything I owned." "She did," Mathew said with a telling finality. He stared John dead in the eyes, gripping the pistol in his lap, hoping that the slow-witted fool across from him would finally realize what the hell was going on. Realization sank home. The big brown watery eyes hardened, dangerously so. How long? Do you mean how long where Hannah Cox, not Wiermore, Cox, and I sleeping with each other? Yeah. Since high school, almost the entire time you two were together. Whenever she'd get tired of your fat ass three-pumping her missionary style, smelling of cheap beer and cigarettes, she'd come to me for some real love. Even when I was in the army? You two... John's words trailed off. Mathew almost felt sorry for the dumb slob. You weren't even gone long before you jacked up your foot, but yeah, we screwed the first night you deployed. It was like a celebration. She was pregnant with Olivia, Matt. John practically pleaded. How could you screw another man's pregnant wife? Mathew nearly fell in on himself, dejected by how stupid his old friend was. John, you stupid donkey, have you ever done a single math problem in your entire life? Did you ever think to bust out a calendar and use your fingers to count to 9? Hannah got pregnant 3 months after you deployed. 3 months. Do the math, you retarded lumberjack. Chapter 5. The Backyard. Mathew barely had time to realize that a half-dozen serpentine tendrils were lashing out at him from across the table before he fully understood that he was in danger. He brought the .357 up and got off a single shot before slimy tendrils whiplashed the pistol out of his hand. The gunfire immediately deafened him. Even through the ringing in his ears, he could hear John roaring in pain and rage as he rose to his full height. Realization that his wife had been cuckolding him for decades with their best friend from high school, his business partner, and that it was the two of them that were the blood parents of his only daughter. Before Mathew could even move, John had tossed the table between them aside with the slithering tendrils that had replaced his left arm. With his human hand, he grabbed up the smaller man by his neck and slammed him against the open door of the shed house. The air in Mathew's lungs expelled in a single blast. As he wheezed and flailed impotently at the hand around his neck, John continued to smash him over and over against the door. Even in middle age, John was a powerfully built man, but the strength he demonstrated in that moment was preternatural. Mathew couldn't think of anything except survival, but as terrified as he was, he couldn't help but notice that the magnum round he had fired had not missed John. It had blasted a hole square in his chest. Inky goo was seeping out from the chest wound, but it didn't slow the large man down, nor did it stop the serpentine tendrils protruding from the left sleeve of his battered flannel from flailing and whipping about. In the tenebrious shed, the tendrils seemed to be on guard, almost sentient. Mathew watched as the life was being beaten out of him as the man he murdered 10 years earlier transformed in front of him. Big dark eyes grew bigger and longer, inky black, more like the monstrous holes in the face of the man he once knew. Like the eyes, his mouth fell open, impossibly large, as if his jaw really had come unhinged earlier when he was foolishly goading the man into a physical altercation. Beneath the milky flesh, the skin bulged and writhed and spasmed and squirmed as if 1,000 snakes had moved in and hollowed out what should have been John's flesh and bones. Whatever it was inside of John was strong and fast, so fast. Barely conscious, Mathew realized he was flying through the air, and the bleary, wet ground was coming at him fast. He rolled over, propelled by nothing but adrenaline, to face his attacker, and immediately realized he shouldn't have done that. What was once a man named John Wiermore, 10 years older than the man Mathew himself had chopped up and tossed into barrels of hydrochloric acid, now stood a horrific, lumbering horror of a creature that was more serpentine tendrils in a vaguely human flesh suit than a human being. Mathew had just enough time to realize the ringing in his ears wasn't just in his ears. The air around him was filled with it. The high-pitched noise was punctuated by an odd metallic warbling sound and a sensation that was more physical than audible, not unlike fingers on a chalkboard. The sounds were pulverizing his brain, and his nose filled with a smell something akin to toast and ozone. If this was what Hannah had endured earlier that evening, she was a remarkable woman for being as composed as she had been when he had walked through the front door just a few hours prior. It had been Hannah, not Mathew, that had speculated that John was a glitch in the Matrix, a Mandela effect, or a twinner from a Stephen King novel. Like Mathew, she knew it couldn't actually be John Wiermore. What Mathew hadn't told John, what he hadn't gotten around to telling him before he started getting the life beat out of him, was that Hannah had been in on the murder plot the entire time. John had been way more valuable dead than alive, and the two lovers had gotten really good at tricking John over the years. They'd been fooling the big dumb bastard long before Hannah found herself pregnant with Mathew's baby. Mathew and Hannah had spent years making sure the family will and insurance policies were just right to maximize the wealth they would receive upon John's death. They both planned the entire thing down to every last detail. The only snag was when John was deemed missing instead of dead. It took a lot to correct that oversight, but it didn't stop them from being together. It didn't stop them from building condos over the ruins of the furniture factory and John's incinerated remains. It didn't stop them from starting a new modern shop in an industrial park that they co-owned, or taking the profits to remodeling their home and put their lovely daughter Olivia into prep school. It didn't stop them from loving each other while raising Olivia together. Mathew couldn't lift himself off the ground. It felt as if a physical force was pushing down on him, a vibrational frequency so strong as to paralyze him and make him feel like his brain was being liquefied. He heard what he thought was a shotgun blast. He watched as an invisible force hit the side of John's face and tore 1,000 tiny holes into what was left of the lumbering man's flesh suit. The nightmarish creature slowly turned its head in the direction of the shotgun fire, but the tendrils lashed out without thought, without hesitation, at its attacker. Mathew was certain he would vomit any second and drown in that vomit as he used every last ounce of determination he had to turn away from the creature that was once John Wiermore. He wished he hadn't, as his entire world was taken from him before his own dying eyes. The tendrils had lashed out, whipping the shotgun out of Hannah's bony arms and wrapping around her thin neck. The tendrils had grown long and thick, and god damn it, it seemed to Mathew that each tendril was capable of independent thought. Even as Mathew watched the love of his life, the mother of his daughter, lifted off the ground, they continued to grow. Whatever the creature was that had taken over John's body, it thrived on the madness-inducing sounds pulverizing him and his family. It was then that Mathew realized Olivia was standing helplessly behind her mother as a single tendril reared back, as if taking aim, before plunging effortlessly through Hannah's chest and out the backside of the thin woman. Blood splattered on Olivia's terrified face a split second after she realized her mother had been murdered by the horror in her backyard. And just before the tendril stabbed through the vulnerable meat and veins of her young throat, Mathew let out an involuntary bellow of anguish that rivaled the one that John made just moments earlier inside the shed house as his dead-eyed wife fell to the ground and his beautiful daughter dropped to her knees, hands at her throat, choking to death on her own blood. Mathew roared and roared in anguish, but the unearthly sounds oppressing him drowned out his own impotent noise. What a fool he had been. What a stupid, arrogant fool he was for bragging about screwing another man's wife to his face, for revealing he had fathered the beautiful daughter that John had always thought was his own, who he had raised as his own. What a stupid, arrogant prick he had been for thinking he could murder another man, steal his entire life, then brag about it to his face. Mathew would never learn how another John Wiermore, a John Wiermore from a world where the two had simply parted ways as business partners and moved on with their lives, appeared on his driveway one night, 10 years after dissolving the man's body in acid. But it had happened, and the price for John Wiermore's return was regrettable.
Thanks for listening. It's listeners like you to make what we do possible.